Story number 1. It was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip, just a weekend out in the woods to get away from everything. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks. It was me, my buddy Josh, and our friend Sarah. We'd packed up everything: tents, food, fishing gear, you name it, and headed out to this spot deep in the national forest that Josh had been to once before. According to him, it was secluded, beautiful, and perfect for camping. We reached the site just before sunset, the golden light filtering through the trees as we set up camp next to a small creek. It was one of those perfect picture book moments. The air was crisp, the smell of pine was everywhere, and the only sounds were the rushing water and the occasional chirp of birds. No cell service, no noise, just the three of us and nature. I couldn't have asked for anything better. The first night went exactly as planned. We built a fire, roasted some marshmallows, and sat around telling stories. Eventually, we crawled into our tents, the sound of the creek lulling us to sleep. Everything felt calm, peaceful, just like I'd imagined. It was the next day when things started to feel off. We decided to go for a hike that morning, following a trail that wound deeper into the woods. It wasn't an official trail, just something Josh had come across the last time he was out here, but it was easy enough to follow. The trees got denser, and the light that had been so warm and welcoming the day before now seemed dimmer. The further we went, the quieter everything got. The birds stopped chirping, the breeze died down, and there was this stillness in the air that didn't sit right with me. We must have been hiking for about an hour when we stumbled upon this old run-down cabin. It wasn't marked on any maps, and there were no signs anyone had been there in years. The roof was partially collapsed, the windows shattered, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. Sarah, being the curious one, immediately wanted to go check it out. I hesitated, that weird feeling in my gut starting to tighten. Josh was all for it though, so I followed them reluctantly. As we got closer, I noticed something strange. The cabin looked abandoned, sure, but there were fresh footprints in the dirt leading up to the door. Big ones, like someone had been there recently. I pointed them out to Josh and Sarah, but they brushed it off. Probably just some hikers, they said. But that feeling in my gut, it was getting worse. We stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under our weight. The place smelled like mold and rot, but what struck me was how out of place it felt. There were empty food cans in the corner, some old blankets piled up like a makeshift bed, and scattered cigarette butts on the floor. Someone had been here, and recently. Okay, we've seen it. Let's go, I said, trying to hide the unease creeping up my spine. But just as we turned to leave, I heard it. A twig snapping. Not outside, inside. Did you guys hear that? I whispered, my heart starting to pound. Josh and Sarah looked at me like I was crazy, but then it happened again. This time, the sound was louder, closer. Someone was in the cabin with us. Without thinking, I grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the door. We need to go, now. Josh was still looking around, trying to figure out what was going on, but that's when we all heard it. A low, raspy voice coming from the shadows, somewhere in the back of the cabin. Where do you think you're going? I don't think I've ever moved so fast in my life. We bolted out of the cabin, sprinting down the trail as fast as we could, the sound of footsteps behind us growing louder. Whoever was in that cabin wasn't just some random hiker. They were chasing us, and they were fast. We ran for what felt like miles, not stopping until we were completely out of breath and our legs felt like jelly. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone charging after us, but eventually, the footsteps faded, and the forest was silent again. We didn't stop until we made it back to our campsite, where we collapsed by the fire, gasping for air. What the hell was that? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we weren't alone in those woods, and whoever, or whatever, was in that cabin had no intention of letting us leave without a scare. That night, none of us slept. Every rustle of the wind, every crack of a branch, made my heart race. We packed up first thing in the morning, abandoning the rest of our weekend plans and heading back to civilization. On the drive home, we barely spoke. It wasn't until we reached the highway that I finally allowed myself to relax. But even then, that feeling in my gut lingered. Something had been watching us out there, something dangerous. I don't know who or what was living in that cabin, and I don't want to know. All I know is that we were lucky to get out of there when we did. Sometimes you've just got to trust your gut, because it might be the only thing standing between you and something you can't explain. Story number 2. There's something about late night drives that's supposed to be peaceful, right? You roll down the windows, put on some music, and enjoy the quiet roads with no one around to bother you. Well, not this night. This night became the single most terrifying moment of my life, and I'll never forget the gut feeling that saved me. I had just finished visiting my cousin in the next town over, a small, sleepy place that didn't see much excitement. It was late, probably around 11:30 p.m., and I had about a 45-minute drive ahead of me to get back home. No big deal. I'd driven that stretch of road 100 times. It was a straight shot, mostly highway, surrounded by nothing but fields and trees. I remember feeling relaxed at first, the hum of the engine mixing with the sound of the night. The road was empty, not a single car in sight. The moon was full, lighting up the landscape enough that I didn't even need my high beams. I was halfway home when I noticed headlights behind me, just a single pair in the distance. At first, I didn't think anything of it, but after a few minutes, the car sped up and got closer. Much closer. The car pulled up right behind me, practically tailgating. I glanced in my rearview mirror, trying to get a look at the driver, but the headlights were so bright that I could barely see anything. I tapped my brakes lightly, hoping they'd back off, but they didn't. Instead, they stayed glued to my bumper, and this sinking feeling started creeping up inside me. I tried to tell myself it was just some jerk in a hurry, someone who'd eventually pass me and go on their way, but they didn't. Instead, the car swerved into the other lane and sped up, pulling alongside me for a few seconds. I could feel my heart rate pick up as I glanced over, but the windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see anything. Just the silhouette of the car. Then, as quickly as they'd pulled up beside me, they fell back behind me again. That's when I knew something was wrong. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just an impatient driver. Whoever was behind the wheel was toying with me, and I was stuck in the middle of nowhere with no one around to help. I tried speeding up, hoping I could outrun them, but they matched my speed. Every time I accelerated, they did too. Every time I slowed down, they did the same. It was like they were trying to box me in, control the pace of the drive. Panic started bubbling up in my chest as I realized I had no idea what they wanted, but it wasn't good. That's when the gut feeling hit me. I had to do something, and I had to do it fast. There was an exit coming up, a small, unmarked dirt road that led off into the woods. I knew it didn't go anywhere useful, just to some old backcountry trails. But at that moment, it was my only option. I turned my blinker on, hoping they'd think I was about to pull off. As I approached the exit, I jerked the steering wheel at the last second, swerving onto the road without signaling. The tires screeched as I sped down the dirt path, the car bouncing wildly over the uneven ground. For a split second, I thought I'd lost them. The road was narrow and rough, and I didn't see their headlights behind me. But that relief didn't last long. In my rearview mirror, I saw the glow of their headlights again. They'd followed me. I floored it, my car fishtailing on the dirt, but I couldn't shake them. The road was too rough, and I wasn't going fast enough to lose them. Then, up ahead, I spotted something. The entrance to an old service road that ran parallel to the highway. It was hidden by overgrown trees and bushes, and it was barely wide enough for a car. I yanked the wheel hard to the right and veered off the dirt road, praying they wouldn't see me. I killed my lights and parked behind some bushes, my heart pounding in my ears as I sat there in the darkness, holding my breath. For a moment, nothing happened, and then I saw their headlights pass by, speeding down the road where I'd been just moments before. They hadn't seen me. I waited until their lights disappeared completely before letting out the breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. I stayed hidden there for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move. I kept expecting them to circle back, to find me sitting there in the dark, but they didn't. Eventually, I got up the courage to start the car again and slowly made my way back to the highway, taking the long way home just to be safe. I never found out who was in that car or what they wanted, but the feeling that they had something sinister in mind stuck with me for a long time. It wasn't until later that I heard about a string of attacks on drivers in that area. People being followed, run off the road, and robbed or worse. The police never caught the people responsible, but the description of the car matched the one that had been chasing me that night. If I hadn't trusted my gut and swerved off the road when I did, I don't know what would have happened. But I'll tell you one thing. Now every time I drive that stretch of highway, I make sure I'm not alone, and I keep my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, because you never know when someone might be watching, waiting for the right moment. Story number 3. You never really expect things to go wrong at a place like a family reunion. I mean, it's supposed to be one of the safest settings, right? Everyone's just hanging out, grilling burgers, and talking about the old days. But that day, I'll never forget the way the air shifted, the way my gut twisted before everything went to hell. It was the middle of summer, one of those perfect afternoons where the sky is blue and the sun is blazing. We were at this big county park by a lake, maybe 30 or so of us. Cousins, aunts, uncles, you name it. We had rented out this picnic shelter, one of those open-air buildings with a roof and picnic tables inside, perfect for family get-togethers. There were kids tossing a football, adults setting up grills, and a few of us just lounging around, soaking up the sun. After a while, someone noticed the sky getting darker. Not like sunset dark, but that deep, menacing kind of dark you see when a storm is coming. No one was too worried though. Summer storms are a dime a dozen around here. It had rained for a bit, cool everything off, and then the sun would come back out. We started packing up the food and moving the coolers inside the shelter, ready to wait out the rain. But something felt wrong. I don't know how to explain it, but as we were bringing everything in, I got this feeling. It wasn't like the usual, oh, here comes the rain vibe. No, this was something deeper. A gnawing sense of dread started bubbling up in my chest, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. It was like the air had changed, heavier, thicker. I stood there for a second, staring out across the lake, trying to figure out what was bothering me. And then I saw it. A funnel cloud, way off in the distance, swirling lazily above the treetops. Now, I've lived through storms, plenty of them. Tornado warnings? Sure, I've seen a few. But this time, something clicked inside me. It wasn't just the sight of that funnel cloud. It was the way the wind shifted, the way the sky seemed to close in on us. That gut feeling was screaming at me, louder than anything I'd ever felt before. We need to leave, now. I turned to my wife, who was chatting with my sister, and grabbed her arm. Get our daughter, get in the car. She looked at me like I was crazy, but one glance at my face must have convinced her something was seriously wrong. My brother-in-law saw the panic in my eyes too. What's going on, man? He asked, his voice tense. Tornado, I said, my voice shaky. We need to leave, now. I'll never forget the look on his face when he turned and saw that distant funnel cloud. He didn't say a word, just started shouting for everyone to pack up and get in their cars. But it was too late for packing. The wind picked up out of nowhere, gusting so hard that one of the picnic tables inside the shelter started to move. It was like nature had flipped a switch from calm to chaos in a heartbeat. People started rushing, grabbing their kids, yelling for everyone to get to safety. I sprinted to the car with my wife and daughter, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear the wind. As soon as we got inside, I turned the key, but I didn't even have to put the car in gear before the tornado siren started wailing. The sound was so loud, it felt like it was coming from inside my skull. My wife and daughter were both crying, and all I could think about was getting us the hell out of there. Through the windshield, I could see the funnel cloud getting closer, picking up speed. I slammed the car into reverse and backed out of the parking lot, glancing at the picnic shelter one last time. Some of my relatives were still running for their cars, and part of me wanted to scream at them to move faster, but my instincts were telling me to keep going. We peeled out of the lot and onto the road, the tornado siren still blaring in the background. It wasn't until we were about a mile away, safe in the shelter of a gas station, that I realized just how lucky we were. The storm hit hard, harder than anyone expected. By the time we made it to safety, the sky had turned a sickening shade of green, and the wind was ripping through the trees like they were made of paper. We waited out the storm, huddled together in the gas station's back room, with a few other people who had fled the park. The tornado passed us by, but when we got word about what had happened back at the reunion site, my heart sank. The picnic shelter we'd rented? Gone. Just a slab of concrete left, with debris scattered everywhere. The tornado had hit it dead on, leaving nothing behind. Cars were flipped, trees uprooted, and the place looked like a war zone. If we'd stayed even a few minutes longer, we would have been trapped there. No one would have survived. I'll never forget the feeling in my gut that day, the way it told me to run before my brain could process what was happening. That instinct saved my life, my wife's life, and my daughter's. The rest of the family got out in time, thank God, but none of us ever look at storms the same way again. Sometimes the scariest moments in life are the ones where you don't have time to think, just time to act, and if you're lucky, you'll listen to that voice inside you before it's too late. Story number 4. You never think a quick stop at the store could turn into one of the scariest moments of your life, but that's exactly what happened to me. It started as a normal Friday afternoon, and I was out running errands, picking up a few things before heading home for the weekend. My last stop was at this small convenience store a couple miles from my house. I just needed to grab some milk and snacks, nothing out of the ordinary. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a couple of cars, and inside it was quiet too. The cashier gave me a nod when I walked in, and I nodded back. No big deal. I grabbed a basket and started walking through the aisles, taking my time. But then, halfway through, I noticed a guy walk in. He was tall, wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled up even though it was warm out, and something about him immediately felt off. He didn't head for the shelves or grab a basket. Instead, he walked right past me toward the back of the store, not looking at anything, just pacing around. I tried to shake off the weird feeling. It's not like people can't wander around a store, right? Maybe he was waiting for someone, but something about the way he moved, the way his eyes darted around, made me feel uneasy. I kept shopping, trying to ignore him, but as I walked to the front of the store with my basket, I noticed he wasn't pacing anymore. He was just standing near the back, watching. The second I saw his hand disappear under his hoodie, something in me screamed, "Leave now." I didn't stop to think. I didn't even go to the cashier. I just turned and walked straight out of the store, my basket still in hand. My heart was pounding, and I was trying not to look like I was running, but everything inside me was screaming to get out of there. As soon as I reached my car, I tossed the basket on the ground, fumbled with my keys, and jumped inside. I barely had the door shut when I saw the guy come out of the store. But now, he wasn't just some random guy. He had a gun. He was holding it low, hidden under his hoodie, but it was unmistakable. I ducked down in my seat, watching as he looked around the parking lot, scanning for something, someone. My car was parked near the back, and I guess he didn't notice me, because after a few seconds, he turned and walked back into the store. My hands were shaking as I started the car, adrenaline flooding my body. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I drive away? What if he saw me leaving? My heart was racing, but that gut feeling, the one that had told me to leave, was still there, telling me I needed to get as far away from this place as possible. I backed out of the parking lot as slowly as I could, trying not to draw attention. As I pulled onto the road, I saw a car pulling in, completely unaware of what they were walking into. I wanted to scream at them, to tell them to turn around, but there was nothing I could do. I drove down the street, my hands still shaking, and pulled over a few blocks away to call the police. I told them everything about the guy, the gun, the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. They said they'd send someone out right away, but by the time they got there, it was too late. I heard about it on the news later that night. The guy had robbed the store at gunpoint, holding up the cashier and the two customers who walked in after me. One of the customers, a woman in her 20s, had tried to run, and he shot her. She survived, thank God, but she was in critical condition. The guy got away with a few $100s, but the damage he left behind? That was worth so much more. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to being one of those people. If I hadn't listened to that gut feeling, if I'd stayed in the store just a few minutes longer, I would have been there when it all went down. I could have been the one on the ground, begging for my life, or worse. It's a strange thing, feeling grateful and guilty all at once. Grateful that I got out, that I wasn't hurt. Guilty that I didn't do more, didn't warn anyone, didn't call the police sooner. But that gut feeling, it saved my life. I've learned to trust it ever since. It's not something you can explain, but when it hits, you've got to listen. I still drive by that store sometimes, though I haven't gone inside since. Every time I pass it, I think about how different things could have been, how close I came to being caught in something terrible. And I remind myself that sometimes, that gut instinct is the only warning you get before everything changes in the blink of an eye.